Now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, President Elizabeth L. Hillman. Dr. Hillman is the 14th president of Mills College. She brings to Mills extensive experience in higher education administration and instruction, with a distinguished background working on gender issues and women's issues. Dr. Hillman's expertise in sexual violence and gender issues in military organizations and culture has brought her national and international recognition. Dr. Hillman is the former provost and academic dean at the University of California Hastings College of the Law. She was also an officer in the U.S. Air Force, where she served as a space operations officer and orbital analyst. Please welcome President Hillman.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not sure how the Navy got to Albuquerque, but I'm impressed with that. I also want to thank everybody who's actually making the effort to join this tremendous battle that we're facing. In fact, we've actually listened to a lot of people speak today. For those of you who can, would you just stand up with me for a moment? Could you just get on your feet? I want to say for every one of you who is being relentless, as Ms. Cohen said, we need to be in facing down this battle. And Secretary Moodley just described this as a tremendous fight that actually has been going on for some time. I want to thank you for taking this seriously, because I can't tell you for how long and how many times I've heard from the people who've been affected by these issues in our universities and our colleges, in our armed forces across all this time that we're talking about. And it makes a tremendous difference to have you on their side. So thank you. And could you give yourselves a round of applause for doing that? Thank you. I also want to thank Amy Levy for bringing me here, actually. I wouldn't have had the chance to be here. I want to thank the University of New Mexico and President Stokes for hosting this. Where I'm from, Mills College in Oakland, California. Could you pull up my slides, actually, over there when you're ready? We actually have somebody from Malta who runs our housing development and food services, who has the kind of relentless attitude and perspective you would expect for somebody from that space that was so challenged in the past. We also have a graduate of the University of New Mexico who told me I should call out the Lobos and do this woof, woof, woof. Okay. I want to thank you, too. One of the things I'm going to talk about, actually go back one slide for me. Yeah, there you go, title slide. So I also want to make clear the University of New Mexico hosting this is a sign that when I started working on these issues, when I was in the Air Force, which was a long time ago, this was not as nearly as big an issue, or there was so little awareness around it, but there really was not a lack of awareness among the people who were most deeply affected. And I think that what has changed is that many of us who weren't in the trenches of this particular fight against sexual harassment and assault, not everyone was aware of it, but boy, I have to tell you, those trenches have been there for a long time. This has been a big challenge. And when I hear stories of World War II, of the Vietnam War, and our service members who served during those times, when I talk to women who served in particular, their stories often involve incidents of sexual harassment and sexual assault that are not part of our national narratives. So for those of you who are recouping the past around this, starting to understand as well as address the prevention efforts that were highlighted as so critical, I want to thank you for those efforts too. So I called this title, I named this Promise and Peril, because I do feel like that's where we are with respect to addressing sexual harassment and sexual assault. There's tremendous promise because we know so much about what we should be doing now. We also know a lot about what we should not be doing. And unfortunately, we're still doing a lot of that. It's perilous because the challenge is not one to be met quickly, and it's not one to be met without some additional pain and suffering. And that's not least because many of the people who have suffered from these harms in the past are not apt to leap to their feet to thank us for finally paying attention to these issues around them and in their lives. Moreover, we cannot redress the harm that this challenge, this discrimination, this prejudice, this physical harm has brought to individuals. It's changed their lives. It's changed their families. It's changed their careers. We can't actually fix that. So we have to live with that reality. And when we stand up and make changes and start to open these conversations, we open up those boxes of pain too for people in the past, and they come to grips with this. You may have seen people speak about this. I'll tell you, one time recently, I was at a veterans forum, which in the San Francisco Bay Area where Mills College is. Sometimes I'm asked to join some conversations with veterans and service members around these issues. This was actually not a forum about sexual harassment or assault. It was on other topics. But a judge who had been a nurse in the Vietnam War stood up to talk about her experience, extraordinary woman. One of the things she related, and she said it was for the first time, was her experience of being sexually harassed, sexually assaulted during her time in service as a nurse in the Army Nurse Corps during Vietnam. You know, those kinds of stories are very difficult for the people who bring them up, and they change our lens on the past. That's part of the peril. We have to be ready to realize we won't simply be thanked for doing the right thing, and it's not as if we flip the switch and have the right policy that redresses that past. Yet I share Secretary Moodley's others' sense that this is a time when we do have tremendous potential to actually change the needle on this. So today I'll talk to you about a few things, and I'm actually grateful you won't be sitting here listening to me for very long, because we actually know that just sitting there listening to people talk doesn't really do very much, honestly, notwithstanding how much effort people put into bringing folks to talk to you about these things. It's you who have the ideas. It's you who have the perspectives. It's you who engage in the behaviors that will make a difference moving forward and are already changing the organizations that you lead. So I'm grateful that this forum is set up as to give you those opportunities to connect to each other and to actually have a more interactive conversation. But today, for this morning, what I'd like to do is give you a framework for some of the conclusions of a report that I was involved with preparing, that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine prepared. Talk to you some about the follow-on efforts since the production of that report, then share some of my thoughts about where we are right now, not only with respect to the academy and the military around sexual harassment and assault, but more generally. Okay. So I was part of a study committee that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine created to look at the problem of sexual harassment in academic STEM fields. This was a bigger group than the Academy usually convenes. Usually the National Academies focus on particular problems in science, medicine, and engineering. They're problems of a technical nature. They bring their members expertise, which is extraordinary, to bear on those issues. This was different. This was a bigger study committee. It crossed disciplines, it crossed industry and academia. It was chaired by two extraordinary scholars and leaders, Paula Johnson, a cardiologist who's the president of Wellesley College, and Sheila Widnall, a longtime professor of aeronautical science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I knew Dr. Widnall as the first woman to be the Secretary of the Air Force back when I was in the Air Force. The group of people there were marshaled by a great staff at the National Academies to come together to answer some key questions about sexual harassment. First, was it a problem across academic STEM fields? Second, what was its impact? And third, what do we know about what's working to try to prevent and respond to it? Next slide, please. I put up the study sponsors here so you can see that this was an effort broadly supported by private foundations and by the federal agencies. So the government was deeply involved in this. The National Academies is a government agency, a critical part of our national science establishment that's dedicated to recognizing excellence in leadership. The National Academies isn't a natural player to study sexual harassment. To be honest, those of you who are scholars and academics may know that studying sexual harassment has not been the fast track to tenure in the past. Sexual harassment has suffered from not having sufficient marquee value, not getting the kind of expertise and attention that other topics in science, medicine, and engineering and across the academy have received. But these funders, these federal agencies, decided it was important enough that they put resources into actually funding this study panel. Because of that, we have not only a report. I mean, they brought speakers to come, they convened public gatherings. They commissioned studies, but they also funded the dissemination of the report's findings. And they created some collateral. Now that I'm a college president, I talk in marketing terms. I'm sorry for those of you who don't like that. They created some great materials that we could take out there that could help us translate the messages of the report to audiences. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how successfully that's actually worked. Next slide, please. So here's the key slide to share with you what the report said. It's hundreds of pages. Some of you have no doubt looked at it. Some of you maybe have read parts of it. It's been downloaded a tremendous number of times all over the world. Before I give you those key findings, I just want to make clear what it was based on. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine would not endorse a product that was not based on evidence. The study committee had to reach consensus in order to publish the findings of this report. Getting consensus for a lot of people on sexual harassment and sexual assault issues is challenging. The report only has the conclusions that were endorsed by everybody on that study committee. What was that based on? It was based on the data, the evidence, the science, the social science we have around it. And actually, we have quite a lot. Although I said there wasn't a tremendous amount of study that had happened in the past on sexual harassment compared to other issues, it actually had been studied. It had simply not been recognized as a field of study in the past. So we had about 4 decades of studies of sexual harassment. The armed forces were a critical source of that data because the military collected more information and analyzed that information more in depth than just about any other organization, and certainly none as big and as diverse as the armed forces in the United States. So the basis for the findings of the report were in that database, essentially. What did it consist of? Surveys that ask people what their experiences were like, experiments that see how people respond in constructed situations to try to understand. Also, the tremendous socio-legal literature and set of data that's out there. Because sexual harassment has provoked so much conflict and tension, it has naturally ended up in court and in employment decisions. And so there's a significant body of information out there around that. We also had qualitative analysis. The study panel didn't feel like we had enough information, so we commissioned some additional studies. For instance, we hired a team of researchers to go and interview dozens of women who reported having experienced sexual harassment in science, medicine, or engineering academic departments in the past 5 years. And they did an extensive set of interviews with that group so that we had a more recent, and that was just the past 5 years, and it was all people in those fields. So it was a recent set of deeper information for us to assess. That data was extraordinarily consistent about the conclusions that we reached. So the key findings, the first one, in case you didn't know, the current climate permits extensive sexual harassment. We don't need people to come forward and tell us that that's the case. We actually know. Every place. That was clear. The data in the military was consistent with the data from industry and from other economic sectors. Second, if you weren't sure, that hurts us. That hurts the people who experience the sexual harassment. It has tremendously negative consequences. It also hurts the organizations in which they work because it not only causes those organizations to lose the potential contributions of those individuals who are harassed or assaulted, it actually causes them to lose other people who aren't happy, aren't comfortable, aren't willing to tolerate the degree of sexual harassment that they see happening in those workplaces. In addition, and this is important to a place like the National Academies that's interested in the quality of science and the fields and the knowledge that we're trying to gain, the problems we're trying to solve, it reduces the talent pool. There's a tremendous number of people who have been diverted away from making potential contributions because of sexual harassment and sexual assault within institutions that have lost their ability to be a part of those. So it has a tremendous effect if you weren't sure. Next, if you thought the law was working, and I speak as a former lawyer and legal scholar, if you thought the law was working, you're wrong. It's not that we haven't tried. It's not that there aren't well-intentioned attorneys and compliance officers who've been out there. But if we rely only on legal compliance in order to address and solve the problems of sexual harassment, it's just not going to work. In fact, the atmosphere of legal compliance has created counter-incentives to reckoning with this problem in the ways that we're starting to right now. Why is that? Like, just take me. So I'm a college president. I get a report of sexual harassment. I know that the law requires me to do all these things. I also know that if I stand up and talk about an incident of sexual harassment or sexual assault at my institution, for many people out there, it's a sign of weakness, of corruption, of challenge, of damage within the institution that I lead. How can I easily come forward and talk about that with a full-throated, complete account? Plus, what about the privacy concerns, the uncertainties, all of the different pieces that come with actually reckoning with these very sometimes intimate and difficult stories to tell about our institutions? We have embedded conflicts of interest in having institutions manage sexual harassment, sexual assault claims. That's a big challenge for us as institutional leaders. It has not been erased by any means, but we have started to turn the corner to recognize that the law has to be a baseline from which we seek to change the behavior that enables us to create preventive climates, places where this is not likely to occur, not places where it's not dealt with in an open and honest and fair manner to those who are harmed by it, because we're afraid of the reputational harm of it happening. If there's one thing that I'm grateful the Academy's report did, it's that it told all of us, this is a problem and it's happening. If you're not talking about it, it's not because it's not happening at your institution, it's because you haven't dealt with it yet. That has to be the bar that we set for this, not that people have to come forward to tell us that it's a problem. And then finally, here's the hopeful part. We actually know some of what works. I mean, this is the great piece of this. We do know some of the things that help. So the midshipmen from the Naval ROTC unit who met me this morning, and the folks from the Department of the Navy who met me this morning and last night when I came in from Oakland, Lieutenant Colonel Kipfer, Lieutenant Carlson, they were tremendously respectful. Maybe those of you who are in the service right now don't realize how well you treat your visitors compared to how the rest of us usually treat our visitors. I remember when I was at the Air Force Academy, we took great care of the guests who came to speak there, and they were always surprised. Now I'm manifesting my own surprise at that. And I have to say, that kind of respect and civility and taking care of people, that's something the military has a big advantage on the rest of us in doing that. Military has some disadvantages in sexual harassment and sexual assault culture as well, but that's a big advantage. And I'll tell you, in that how to change the climate and culture to improve things, that's something the rest of us need to learn from the armed forces. Increased civility and increased respect in workplace environments reduces the incidence of sexual harassment. It makes it less likely that these behaviors will persist when people demonstrate respect, humility, recognition of the value of what people bring to that. So changing the climate and changing the culture can make a difference. Usually when I'm out there talking about some of the detailed recommendations of the report, the one that gets the most interest and gets people excited is bystander intervention. Because you know what that says to us? It says that whoever you are, let's say you're not at all, you've never had a harassing thought in your life, you're free of the biases that encumber most of us, and you just want to be a positive player at work. What do you do about this sexual harassment problem? Well, now, as a bystander, you can play a part. But you can't play a part if you don't practice and learn how to do it. You wouldn't go out on a basketball court and take a shot for the first time that mattered without ever preparing for it. So to be an effective bystander, what do you have to do? Well, first you have to notice something's going on. We haven't always noticed. We have overlooked this happening in our organizations for a long time. So if you can train yourself to see it. Some of you are probably artists. Some artists have told me the most important thing they do is see, recognize, witness. If they can't see it, they can't reproduce it. If they can't visualize it, they can't make it into a form that others can see and appreciate. So first, bystanders have to see it. Then bystanders have to say, hey, this was wrong. Then they have to decide, it's my responsibility to intervene. Then they have to decide how to intervene. So it helps if they have a toolkit. What are the things that I might do in this situation? And then they have to intervene. You know, it helps, just like if you took that shot on the basketball court, it helps if you practice. So some of the things that we can do are to give people those tools so that they can, as bystanders, intervene. Those are some of the promising ways that changing the culture and the climate can alter behaviors. It's more than simply understanding the definition of sexual harassment or sexual assault, definitions that are in fact changing some right now. But it actually is more than that. It's actually changing our behavior and how we can work together. Next slide, please. This is the iconic image that came out of the National Academy's report. It's the iceberg. The most recent request that I know about that came to the National Academies was through the UN from the Serbian delegation. They wanted to translate it into Serbian for distribution on social media. The National Academy's report was also being translated into French the last time that I heard about it. It's been downloaded thousands of times all around the world. It's in the top 1% of all National Academies reports ever released. It's in the top 1% in the altmetric measures for research findings for other reports published around the same time frame. The media that went out after the National Academies report reached some apparently 8 billion people. Now that's not possible if they were all different people, so anyway, but that's what the number came out as, so that it actually reached a tremendous number of people. The National Academies worked on the social media side. I've spoken, and many others have spoken at lots of university forums. This is a unique gathering right here because you've brought together the military as well as the university community and the local community too. That's different than what many of these have been like, but many institutions have used this report to move forward. This is the image that has garnered the most attention. So what is it? It takes what has been a pretty stable definition of sexual harassment that has 3 parts. The first part is the very top, sexual coercion. That's what most people instantly now recognize as sexual harassment, and that is requesting a sexual favor and conditioning that on some workplace or other positive good. That's sexual coercion. Everyone pretty much now recognizes that as sexual harassment. That's not something we need to educate the public on particularly, but it is something that actually constitutes a very tiny fraction of all the sexual harassment that takes place. So if that's the entire universe of public understanding of sexual harassment, we're not doing much to stop it. Next up there is unwanted sexual attention. Those are sometimes collapsed into come-ons. That is attention that is sexualized, that people get in a workplace environment that they do not want. That's also something that many people think of as a part of sexual harassment. So that's still above the waterline of public consciousness, which is on this slide. But then most of the iceberg is below the waterline. And what is that? That's gender harassment. Those are more put-downs than come-ons. Those are derisive comments. Those are sabotage of persons of a gender that someone doesn't think belong in that particular workplace. There are terrifying examples of sabotage in field situations that have put people at tremendous physical, emotional risk. It's insults, it's images. That gender harassment is the huge majority of the harassment that's taking place. What's the impact of that gender harassment? It's tremendous. Its impact, if repeated and sustained, is every bit as great as the impact of that tip of the iceberg part that most people think of as the most egregious type of sexual harassment. So the good thing about that below the waterline piece, gender harassment by definition is not screened from view. If people tell us, wow, we can't fix this unless you come forward and tell us about it. Wow, wait a minute, all that gender harassment, if that's the lion's share of what the problem is that's out there, people see it. Other people see it. This is not a two people in a contested narrative of what exactly happened in some space that others did not see. It's really very different. It's something everybody can see. So that means the space for bystander intervention and actually engagement across our organizations, whether they're universities or military units. It means that it's a much bigger space to intervene, that our potential muscle's much greater than actually trying to figure out what happens in very contested situations. And it's important, and we absolutely have to figure out how to do that better still, but it's actually not the bulk of the problem. So the recommendations of the report. I'm going to show you a little video about this that does a better job than I will, but I just wanted to put the words up there for those of you who like text. So first, the first set of recommendations of the report is about values, that we have to integrate values into the system. I think the armed forces have an advantage on this in some ways because there are so many values that motivate the kind of service and commitment and sacrifice that we require of our service members. I remember at the Air Force Academy when I was teaching there was a sign above the elevator that said, integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. That kind of thing, if read in the right way, is exactly what we need to fight this kind of problem. But we also have to make sure inclusiveness, diversity, and respect accompanies that. And that hasn't always been the case in some subsets and in some spaces within the armed forces. Next, change the power dynamics. Okay, this can be tricky in the armed forces. You all wear your rank on your sleeve. I remember when I left the Air Force and I went to Yale Law School, I thought, wow, this is going to be so different. Now there's not going to be this hierarchy that's so strict, and it's going to be easier to navigate, and I'm going to understand. And then I just thought, gee, I wish they would wear on their epaulets, and so I could tell. And then I realized the professors who were chairs sat in the middle in the biggest armchairs with wing-backed, in the faculty lounge, and then the next set, the associate professors sat around them, and then the graduate students and the rest of the people were on the folding chairs at the edges. So power dynamics aren't only for the military. Maybe it's easier because it's so apparent in the armed forces. Maybe it's not. I also think that the different branches and units and functional groups of the military they work in different ways around these hierarchies. But I do think the military has to continue to reckon with this because the power dynamics are a problem. The greater the power disparity between different groups, the more likely it is that that power is going to be exploited. And the National Academy's report made some recommendations that have actually already gotten legs out there around reducing the power differential between trainees and mentors. Now, in my own space now, in the university and college setting, this is the difference between tenured professors who run labs and make it rain money for all their researchers, and the beseeching graduate students who knock on their door hoping to get a job and a toehold into a profession that they very much want to contribute to. That's tough, but we can think about how to change funding so that it attaches more to individuals. We can think about how to create networks of mentors rather than individual one-on-one mentoring relationships, which is more what we would call an invitation to mischief in the law. We can do more, and I'll tell you that graduate students in science, medicine, and engineering across the country love this proposal when I talk to them. They say, graduate students should get independent funding? Yes, and we should have some control over an advisor. Some of you may have been in a situation where you worked with a particularly charismatic advisor. Sometimes that person isn't always there at the end of the day. Sometimes life intervenes, not sexual harassment, but things happen. It's actually puts someone in a vulnerable position to rely on one person. So trying to build some resilience into that advising system and the funding systems that we use for our most important engineering, science, and medical labs, that's actually a good goal apart from the sexual harassment piece. Next, support the targets of sexual harassment. The language that we use is tough here. Victims, survivors, targets. The National Academy's report chose targets, recognizing that the people who actually suffer from sexual harassment need our support, whether they come forward or not, whether they're willing to press charges and actually become public with this, and that we can do more to help them. Because many people can contribute. An incident of sexual harassment or a long-term experience in sexual harassment doesn't erase the capacity of somebody to contribute to their field. If we can support them, they can recover. People are tough. They can manage a lot of difficult things. They long have, and they will continue to. If we can help them build some networks of support around them, that will make a difference. They need to know that the leadership of their organizations will support them too. And then the last one, transparency and accountability. This is the most lawyerly of these sets of recommendations. This may be the trickiest in some ways, but we have to do it, and we do have some models for it. One of the things that is most determinative of an environment having a lot of sexual harassment is the perception that reports of sexual harassment are not taken seriously. The only way that we can actually be sure that people think we're taking a report of sexual harassment seriously is to tell them when we have a report of sexual harassment and let them know that there's an outcome to that report of sexual harassment. And this can be really tough. It's not always a short time between the report and the conclusion. It's not always simple to decide where culpability lies and what the appropriate disciplinary or educational response is in those cases. So we have trouble with time, with the identity of the persons who we're dealing with being fair and allowing sufficient process to those who are accused of harassment or assault. That's a challenge, but we have to do better, and we're getting there. At small institutions like mine, this is hard because if I say there's an incident in the Department of X, there's only like 3 professors in the Department of X, and there's only like, a few dozen students in that. We're a small college. It's actually a space where people know each other. If you're in a small unit somewhere, same thing, right? If you're in a very big space, sometimes the huge numbers that come out can be a challenge. I think all the armed forces are struggling right now, that the reporting in the surveying is telling us there's still a tremendous amount of assault that's happening out there that's not being reported. We have to figure out how to communicate that data honestly and not have people lose faith that we're moving in the right direction. Okay, the video for you now.
As a country, we have woken up to the ways women's lives are impacted by sexual harassment. The time has come to focus on academic institutions, especially in male-dominated fields like science, engineering, and medicine. Together, we can do better by creating a climate that discourages all forms of sexual harassment, including sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attention, and gender harassment. Research shows that we must do more than attend occasional training sessions and review vague policies and procedures. Here is what we need to do. 1. Integrate values into the system. Policies and procedures must embody the institutional values of diversity, inclusion, and respect, especially for hiring, promotion, and tenure decision-making. 2. Change the power dynamics. With funding, research focus, and professional reputation wrapped up in a single advisor-trainee relationship, the potential for abuse is too high. Institutions need to diffuse these dependencies by encouraging advisor networks and provide independent funding so students and trainees have options. 3. Support targets of sexual harassment. Many women don't report sexual harassment because they fear it will hurt them in their careers, and it does. Institutions must do more to support targets by providing alternative ways to access support services, record information about an incident, and report an incident without fear of retaliation. 4. Improve transparency and accountability. While still respecting people's privacy, institutions need to make their communities aware of the consequences sexual harassers will face and demonstrate that the institution investigates incidents and holds people accountable. Now is the time for institutions to take action. We can prevent sexual harassment.
So that video has been viewed a lot of times. It's been downloaded. The iceberg image is available. If you would like the iceberg, we could send it to you in Serbian too. This is a flyer that we've put out there, the National Academies put out there, that has been downloaded around the world, and that is being used for interactive meetings. Not a big venue like this where you're just listening, but actually where you're thinking and talking about what this might mean for your organization, your small group, your big lab, your hospital. Next slide, please. What about after the report was released and we did this publicity effort around it? What has happened? One thing that has happened is an action collaborative on sexual harassment in higher education. This is not focused only on science, engineering, and medicine, but on all of academics. It's run by the National Academies, so its staff continues to support it. Next slide, please. So there were 28 institutions that joined at the start. There's now 63. I'm proud to say the University of New Mexico is on this list. So is my institution, Mills College. These are institutions that have made a long-term, sustained commitment to fighting sexual harassment and responding effectively. There's actually more interest than what the academies can support. The collaborative is already as bigger than what they'd really like to manage. There's a few more institutions. In particular, there's some historically black colleges and universities that the academy is working to get on board. We know that sexual harassment is more of a problem for the trans and genderqueer community, but also for people who are from underrepresented racial minorities. This is a huge challenge for us in fighting sexual harassment. It's also a big area for additional research. The Academy's recommendations, we actually know will work, we think will work, for reducing harassment of white women. But we don't have enough information on racial and ethnic minorities to actually know whether these recommendations are enough. We're starting to get more data. I mentioned before that civility training was a potential avenue to success in reducing sexual harassment. There's just recently a study that one of my colleagues on the panel, Lilia Cortina, a researcher at the University of Michigan, she and a colleague just published a study about civility and said that it uses a study from the military and a study from outside the military. It says actually civility training will reduce gender and racial harassment. So we're starting to get more information about what will work. The Action Collaborative is committed to actually sharing best practices and getting more information. Next slide, please. These are its goals: to raise awareness, elevate evidence-based policies and practices, set a research agenda, and measure progress. Next. So I want to spend a few minutes now talking about what, and the Action Collaborative is an ongoing effort, like these efforts, and I actually think connecting what's happening in the military to what's happening in the academy is a great set of connections. We have, in some ways, similar institutions, plenty of hierarchy, a lot of young people, a lot of transformation that's happening to the people who are in our organizations. We ask them to take on tremendous responsibility in many cases, and we have to find ways to better support them regardless of their identities. There are some changes on the national level, international level, that are also altering how we're responding within our institutions to sexual harassment and assault, and also what people expect of us. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about those. First, we're waiting for the changes in Title IX. We know that some will be welcome and some will be not, and that depends on who you ask about them. They have generated a tremendous groundswell of comment. That in itself is a great thing. I actually think it's a wonderful thing for the federal government to relook the Title IX provisions. I said at the front end of this talk that if you thought the law was working, it's not. So Title IX has done many terrific things, and its values are clearly in the right place, but the procedures that it's created, the expense and the energy have been, what's the phrase, return on investment. So, if we were looking at what we've gotten out of that, if the goal was to reduce and prevent sexual harassment, it's not clear that those have been resources invested in the most effective way. So actually relooking this is a great idea. It does seem that what will come out of the Title IX changes will create some challenges for us to continue to investigate fairly and actually figure out what's happening with the responsibility we have in colleges and universities to our students and our employees, our whole community. That's going to be different. We're also seeing some changes on the federal level. The domestic violence definition has shifted. We're at risk of actually rolling back to a definition that doesn't encompass all of the harmful behaviors that actually have a tremendously negative effect on the well-being of individuals. If we narrow the definition of sexual assault and sexual harassment and domestic violence to the point that we actually eliminate everything under that waterline on the iceberg, more or less, that can be incredibly damaging. I mean, if you're running a lab and you repeatedly suggest that women don't really belong in that lab, or that women are in that lab only because you're so beneficent and generous. There was a story in the Academy's qualitative studies. It was an assistant professor of biology who worked in a lab, and she said, the lab director said over and over again, "Isn't it great? I've hired so many women. Look at all these women that I've hired. Look, we're hiring another woman this time." And she said she finally turned to him and said, "Do you want a cookie for that?" So if we take, and that's not actionable sexual harassment, but if we narrow our definition so much that the mental health of the persons who are being affected by this is removed from the calculation. You know that we can't separate mental and physical health. You know that in your lives and your families and your communities, your workplaces, they're deeply intertwined. If somebody is never touching someone else but is really harming them in terms of their mental health, they're having an incredible impact on their career, their health, and their life, and the effectiveness of their organization. So we have to be wary of that. That's going to be a challenge for us moving forward. And yet, I just want to be clear, speaking for myself, not for the National Academy's panel or the work that's happening right now, litigation is not the answer to these problems. I mean, if prevention is what our goal is, you're already in the wrong place. Getting to the left of that problem requires different measures. So while we need people to make sure we're continuing to improve on that front, and I'd say the American Law Institute, another organization that I've been a part of, has been working on best practices for colleges and universities around sexual assault and sexual harassment investigation procedures. Those kinds of long-term, careful efforts to try to figure out what to do, they're going to help us get the right answers on the procedural parts of this. But the changes on the federal level and the regulatory changes are going to continue to impose costs and vulnerabilities on us that will affect the rest of this. And it's uncertain space out there. Ongoing litigation and backlash. So the Harvey Weinstein trial is ongoing. Literally this week. Maybe you have missed that. There's been some other news you may have been paying attention to this week. Tomorrow, his defense will start. That's a milestone case for public recognition and understanding of sexual harassment and assault in a workplace setting, where the same kind of tight hold on power, mentoring relationships, arbitrary decisions, the people who were trying to get ahead in those spaces sometimes resemble the graduate students who are trying to distinguish themselves and move ahead in fields of science, engineering, and medicine that are incredibly competitive, just a very competitive workplace environment, and somebody who took deep advantage of that. And yet we have these images from the trial of somebody who's facing life in prison if convicted on the felony counts that he's facing, on the testimony of 2 women who reported exactly what happened to them in sordid and awful detail and brave detail, but who also a few other women who came forward. This is going to be a challenge. His defense is going to put out there a lot of the arguments around backlash around this. I think he's about to put on a defense that will say the targets of his harassment and assault continue to interact with him, that the incidents took place within the context of consensual relations and not actually only in a non-consensual, that was a small part of overall relationships. Those are the same kinds of arguments. They're going to be above the fold. If you still read newspapers, I shouldn't use that anymore. They're going to be, whatever you call that in your online news feed, they're going to be impossible to miss out there. So I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for us, and we have to recognize it. We have to recognize, too, that the kind of training that we're asking people to engage in now requires a much different degree of effort than it did in the past. We don't need people to listen to a webinar, answer the quiz questions right at the end, and then forget about it until the next December, when that calendar year requirement appears again on their HR calendar, and they have to do that. We need them to think about who they are. We need them to think about what matters to them. We need to think about what their responsibility is. For some people, too, we have to say, you know, that thing that happened to you really long ago that you didn't necessarily think was a big deal and you just brushed it off, maybe that was actually harassment and you were being treated. And that's a reckoning that's actually difficult for those of us who have been in organizations for a long time and have forged ahead. I often get a question about this, well, did you ever experience sexual harassment when you were in the military? And I think, yes and no. I did and I didn't. Actually, it's not a clear answer. I mean, I was fortunate enough not to be harmed significantly by the environments that I experienced. I also had great protection in many ways. Here's one of the things that I think protected me in some ways. I'm a twin. Is anybody in here a twin? Hey, I'm sorry for all the singletons that are here. So the majority of you are singletons. I actually think being a twin, now this is the kind of thing, like me thinking about these issues for a long time has made me realize, I actually think that helped protect me in the course of my life. Why? Because I wasn't alone all that much. I had somebody with me. It's hard to isolate someone who's got a twin. And my sister is very fierce and very smart and much better person than me. So that was also a good thing for me going. But I'll tell you, it's going to be hard to figure out how we manage this moving forward, and it's not simple to ask people to carry these burdens. So we're going to have to help the people who are reckoning with their responsibilities within organizations. We're also going to have to help the people who did something wrong. And I'll tell you, one of the most compelling talks that I heard in the time I've been working on this issue is when I was on Capitol Hill for a hearing, and on the panel with me, talking to the members of Congress who were there, was someone who worked with perpetrators. And he talked about the low recidivism among perpetrators. He talked about how much difference it made for people to be integrated into a community. He talked about the difference that it made for him to work with folks as they realized the impact of their actions and they thought about what they'd done and what they could do moving forward. It's complicated. And so actually being open to helping people reckon with that and to reintegrating people into communities who have made missteps, that's something that we're going to have to do too, and it's going to be more challenging with some of the backlash that we'll face. And the last thing, and I signaled this a little bit earlier, survivors' responses to reform. We're not going to get some pile of thank you notes for the work that we're doing around these issues. Even for the people who are best served by the processes that we have right now, who are bold and confident and strong, who have the network that enables them to come forward and say, this was wrong and I know it, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to somebody else. For all those people who are out there, the system works well, and they're grateful for the legal counsel, the social and emotional support, the professional support that they get. But doesn't fix everything for them, and it imposes some additional costs engaging in those systems, even if they worked perfectly. How many of you are thrilled when you get to visit your therapist? Yeah, it's an investment in your future health, in your family, in your community, in your well-being. But I don't know anybody who's actually really thrilled to be having to spend that time. They'd rather watch a movie, read a book, learn a new language. Like, there's a lot of things they'd rather do than spend their time, their precious time and energy on these particular issues. So we have to recognize that the responses will be slow in some ways to affirm what we're doing, but that we have to recognize that, and it won't be public all the time. You all know, those of you who have worked with persons who've suffered from sexual harassment, they're tremendously grateful that somebody believes them and that they care and that they think there's a way forward after that thing that happened or series of things that happened. I think that's going to be a part of what we reckon with next. Okay, I think that's the last slide. So before I see if we have time for questions, I'm not sure where we are on time, I just want to tell you a quick story. So when I was a lieutenant in the Air Force, it was tailhook, and that was affecting me. When I was teaching, and for those of you who don't know what tailhook is, which I realize I should say, it was a very challenging moment for the Navy when the Naval Aviators Convention allowed and cultivated an atmosphere that permitted extensive sexual harassment and assault. And when the initial reports came out that this had happened at this conference in Las Vegas of naval aviators, it turned out no one had been there because everyone had nothing to say about it. There was a big cover-up that followed those initial reports. That was a really challenging moment. The military's response to it was likewise challenging. So I was in the Air Force. I was working in a joint service environment. I was not too far from here. I was at Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. When I was teaching history at the Air Force Academy, we had the first ever Sexual Harassment Awareness Week, and I gave a lecture to about 1,000 cadets, and there were so many at that because they had to choose one event to go to, and the topic that I was talking about, I'm a historian, was rape and war in historical perspective. So it was harder to go to an interactive session or a lecture about consent and those challenges. It was actually easier to go to a lecture on rape and war in historical perspective, which removed this issue from their immediate space and put it in a larger context. And maybe that's the best way to encounter some of this at first. I don't know. And then I move into the academy and I see Title IX and all these issues coming up again and again in workplaces that I'm in and workplaces that I'm watching. And then I just want to bring you up to the present. Last night, I heard from one of my daughters who's in high school. And just yesterday, a big story broke about a classmate who'd been accused of sexual assault. A lawsuit had been filed against the school district. The school was all roiled all day yesterday by a suit that said that the school knew about that this had happened. They were aware of this place. They hadn't reported it. There was a mandatory reporter who had heard about this incident, and that the person who was accused of committing these acts had been able to continue to do that and affect other girls in the high school, where my kids are in high school. And so I just heard about that last night, and I just thought back years ago when I was working on sexual assault in the military on one of many Department of Defense panels on that. I was going to Washington, D.C., and Vivian, my daughter, said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to work on sexual harassment in the military to hear." And she said, "Why are you doing this?" It wasn't, she was maybe in 4th grade at the time. It wasn't meaningful to her. I'll tell you, it's meaningful to them now. The work that you're doing every day and the way that it's affecting the lives of the people, young and old, who are out there is really very real. So I want to thank you for your investment in that and tell you, you need to help us find the answers, because for all the smart people who worked on that Academy's report, we definitely don't know exactly what to do yet, and you're going to change what happens next for the people in your organizations. Okay, thank you. If we have time for questions, I'd love to take some.
If you'd like to ask a question, please line up at the microphones. Thank you.
Am I more or less on time? I'm not sure when I'm supposed to. Okay, good.
Hillman, I don't know if this is on. Hello? Oh, there we go. I just have to be Shorter. Okay, Dr. Hillman, I'm Liz Hutchison, and I get to speak next. You've given us a great opening to speaking about what leadership means in this context. And I wanted to just ask, because you're also a historian, you said we shouldn't and we can't expect survivors or targets of harassment to applaud and thank us. What do you think are the most important mechanisms for restoring trust in communities where it's been repeatedly broken, as many institutions have? And how do we approach those mechanisms without undermining sort of the existing institutional framework that you've pointed to is our best effort so far but has so many flaws still to overcome?
Thank you for your work, and thank you for that question. That's hard. I think restoring trust is always hard and always at the top of the list for what leaders have to do. Because even when you have a great degree of trust across an organization, things happen. A crisis, a surprise, a health issue, whatever it might be, that starts to unravel that. So I think that always building that is actually a good strategy for all the problems that are out there. But you point particularly to the betrayal that many feel. There are people working now on institutional betrayal, thinking about ways in which we could more effectively, and that's actually how sexual assault, sexual harassment is often experienced by an individual who loves an organization and the work that they're doing and the people they're with, and then that creates an opportunity for exploitation and harm that is a betrayal by an individual who represents an institution to that person who's been harmed. I think that leaders who listen, in my own experience, that's been most effective. So often people want, especially if you're a person who is in a position of authority in an institution, they want to be able to tell you, this is what I experienced, and this was really hard for me. And they don't actually think you're going to hand them the keys to the kingdom and everything is going to be fine. They know that. They've been living with this for a lot of time before they came to you and talked to you. You think it was easy for them to come talk to you? But if they can feel like that's possible, for me, I feel like that's been helpful. It's been helpful from an institutional perspective in that I think that it's diffused anger and frustration in instances. I also think that it's helpful to sense an arc of response. I think that anger and frustration, rage, are reasonable responses to a lot of this, and sometimes people will come at us with that rage. And I think that recognizing that that's helping our other leaders realize that and deal with it is hard. You know, I've worked around these issues for so long, I forget sometimes how challenging it is for someone to be approached by a person who was harmed in the past by someone in that organization, and they think that, you know, my college, my university, my service handled this so badly and they're so angry about it. And I think that helping build the fortitude in our teams to have those hard conversations and hold them and not feel actually, honestly, all that personally responsible. We are all responsible for this, but let's be clear. That was one of the Academy's report recommendations that I really struggled with. It said everyone is responsible for this. Well, you know what I think when everyone is responsible. No one is, right? I think I'm responsible for sexual harassment and sexual assault at Mills College and how we deal with that. I think it's my fault when it happens. But I don't think that it's something that I specifically did wrong. I mean, I don't carry that with me that I've done something wrong on all these things. But if I don't do everything I can to try to fix it, to prevent it moving forward, I think that matters. I don't think that's a good answer to your question about how to restore trust, but it's at least one part of what I would encourage people to do.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. Welcome to UNM. My name is Armando Bustamante. I work at El Centro de la Raza, one of the ethnic centers here on campus. I'm also co-chairing a group that's working on involving men and mask identifying individuals to do some prevention and some recognizing that they can be victims as well, and reporting, correct? And so you spoke about the STEM, the science and all that. We have an issue getting those fields involved with our groups. Do you have any recommendations of what we can do to be able to do that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes it's some departments that are more willing to do this. It's true in medical schools. You know, there's some parts of medical training is not a small thing, right? It's capacious. There's so many different pieces of it. There's a lot of different departments and disciplines. Some of those disciplines are more resistant than others to actually engaging, and some of those that are most resistant are worst offenders. So psychiatry is terrible, philosophy is terrible. Like, there are just some subfields that have very high-profile offenders that it seems have resisted some of the conversations that you're leading and that others will have. I think you need inside help, so I think you need some converts. So, you know, if you can get a couple of people to do this, I went to an engineering school last fall that asked me to come because one person in the department said, we're having a problem with this. You know, our dean says this is a problem, but I have people on my senior faculty who are saying, this is not a problem. This has never been a problem here. Why are we bothering with this? This is really not. But that relatively junior faculty member energized a group of other people, asked the National Academies to send someone, got the support of the dean, and then when I went in, it was an odd meeting. It was a big U-shaped table full of people, many of whom were looking at me like, no. So and you can see sometimes when I talk about this, there's a range of different reactions. But when they start to engage and listen to their colleagues, not necessarily to me, but they listen to other people in the room, and they have that space where they have to hear some of it, I think it can help. But really, I think you need some people on the inside to help you. So, you know, one or two people, they can start to make the difference in that. You are asking them to take a risk by stepping forward on this issue, and that's part of the challenge. It helps if it's a mid-career faculty person, you know, past that tenure point if they can be, because junior faculty often feel overwhelmed and vulnerable. You're also going to face a challenge. I think people across the academic disciplines and on our faculties work incredibly hard, but people in labs, their time seems fully booked most of the time. Their family obligations are intervening, so you have to find a time that works for them. And food often helps. That's all I got. So.
Sherrod, and I'm thrilled to see this because I led the case study that was included in here before coming to the Navy as a prevention highly qualified expert. So very excited to see the progress with the study. Did have a question, and you alluded to this a bit, about the transparency with data. And I remember one of the interviews that I did for that was really the way that they made an impact and sold the administration, having concrete black and white data that said this is an issue and being very transparent with it. I'm wondering if you've been able to make any inroads in regards to data and use of data and transparency, and any suggestions that you have as we're both civilian and military working towards some of those issues.
Well, thank you for your work for the Academies group, and good for the good judgment of the Navy in getting you to work on this piece. There are some stories of institutions opening up web pages. I mean, if we don't post something on the web, then we aren't really telling anyone, it seems. So, which causes us problems with the data being accurate and updated all the time. But still, I'm posting things on websites that are regular updates that are periodic. So we actually aren't asking our teams who are working hard on these issues to post things constantly, but at regular intervals, and that they're putting more information out there helps. I also find the report itself has been helpful because I don't think we no longer have to prove that it's a problem within a particular university. When we have 63 colleges and universities that are in the Action Collaborative that have committed to coming to annual summits, I think there's quarterly check-ins. I just had to schedule a call because I'm the person for our college who is part of this group. I had to schedule a quarterly check-in. I was like, what do you mean? I have to talk to you again about this? So they're actually, those are institutions that have committed to following up regularly on this. And I think I think that's starting to tilt it towards not having to prove that case that you're seeing the data has to prove. But the changes in the political and legal environment that I referenced could shift that dial back, and I think collecting the data and having it ready to go, should we need to make that case on an institutional level as well as a broader sector or regional level, I think that would make a difference too.
Thank you very much. Everyone, thank her again.